Welcome back to the L&S Exchange, a podcast about teaching and learning in the College of Letters and Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today's episode begins a series of conversations with recipients from this year's Distinguished Teaching Awards. 8 of the 13 honorees represent the College of Letters and Science, reflecting the range of disciplines and approaches to teaching across the college. We begin in the Department of History with Brandon Bloch. In this conversation, we celebrate his achievement, take a closer look at what's happening in his classroom, and surface a few practical ideas you might carry into your own teaching. Now here's the conversation Molly Harris and I had with Brandon Bloch. All right, so Brandon, welcome to the L&S Exchange. Could you introduce yourself to our listeners and describe a little bit about your role on campus?
Sure, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. So I'm an assistant professor of history. I've been at UW-Madison since the fall of 2020, so started right during the pandemic. I'm a historian of modern Europe. My research focuses especially on 20th century Germany, themes of religion and human rights in Germany's transition to democracy after World War II. And in my teaching capacity, I teach larger introductory level survey courses on Europe and the modern world, as well as courses on more specialized topics like a seminar on genocide, war crimes, trials, and human rights in the 20th century, which is linked to my research interest in human rights.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brandon. Could you talk a little bit about what has shaped your teaching career? Are there any milestones or anecdotes that have influenced your approach to teaching?
In a course on teaching of the job market, I was exposed to a book by Samuel Weinberg called Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts. His point is that those of us who specialize in an academic discipline have certain habits of mind, ways of seeing the world, which have been inculcated over years of being a part of that discipline. And for our students coming in with a wide range of backgrounds and experiences, they may not immediately have access to the tools to kind of think in the terms of that discipline. So what we're really trying to do in history education, I think, is not so much, simply teach kind of the facts of history, but think about what are the skills of historical thinking. History is a kind of way of seeing the world. That's something that I think any of my history colleagues would agree with. But of course, the question of how do you actually do it is more challenging. And that's, I think, something Weinberg helped me with. I think in terms of resources on UW's campus for listeners who are instructors at UW-Madison, I participated both in Madison Teaching and Learning Excellence, which is a program covering kind of all aspects of teaching, everything from syllabus and assignment design to inclusivity in the classroom, to prep, how can you make your teaching more efficient? That was very helpful. And also the Discussion Project, which is a resource on facilitating discussion in the classroom.
Yeah, thank you.
Was there a moment for you personally where you decided, I'm going into history?
I was an English teaching assistant at a school in Berlin. And Berlin is an interesting place. The city itself is constructed almost as kind of a museum to its very turbulent 20th century history. And the debates around, Germany's 20th century past, how it should be memorialized, how people should respond to it in a society that was increasingly, also diverse. So I think all of that really made me think about how history was really alive today in a way that I hadn't experienced it in college. And I went to some lectures, one in particular by the historian Timothy Snyder, who was speaking about a book called Thinking the 20th Century that he wrote with the late Tony Judt. And it really inspired me to see how a historian could be making these connections between 20th century history and the present moment. And I decided that I thought I could have a larger impact as an academic than if I were to go into the business world, let's just say. So that, I think that was a really critical moment.
So thank you for sharing a lot about what has brought you to become a teacher. And you've recently won a Distinguished Teaching Award. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
Can you share some of the things that maybe your nominators for this award noticed in your teaching, or some of the things that you do in the classroom that maybe could be applicable to other instructors or that our listeners could learn from?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I'll say the first thing that seems very basic, but that has been consistently noted by students and the nominators, is just trying to get to know your students a little bit and learn the names. And I know we're at a big university, and if you teach 400 students, then that's not possible. My classes go well over 100. I mean, I've had up to, 130 undergrads in my lectures. And I really do make an effort to learn the names. I try to get to class around 15 minutes early or so, and especially in the 100 level. So I do 3 times a week for 50 minutes. So you have more regular contact. And if you go in, 3 times a week and you ask students to sit in the same seats each time and kind of make a seating chart, you can go kind of row by row. And eventually you do learn all the names and have a chance to talk, at least once, but if I can more, individually with students, just about kind of where they're from and why they're at UW-Madison and why they want to take this class. But just showing interest in using those 15 minutes before class, even in the lectures, to kind of circulate around and kind of make yourself present and show that you're a person who wants them to learn and not just a lecturer standing at the podium. But I found that that's really made a difference. I also encourage students to come to office hours. I have a lot of first-year students. I'll have extended office hours for 3 or 4 hours for the first couple of weeks. And not everyone, of course, will come, but you can, if you encourage people to understand office hours, I sort of appeal to their professional instinct. Like, you're at a big school, there's 35,000 undergraduates here. If you get to know your professors and establish a personal connection, like, that helps your learning and it's good for your future at UW. Something else, kind of speaking about working, I work very closely with TAs on developing lesson plans that tie into the lectures. My recommendation is one reading. Have your students, especially in a big class, if they're going to be in sections, give them one reading to focus on. If you try to have them cover 5 different authors in 50 minutes, the TA is going to be overwhelmed. People get lost, even if they're short readings. So the one reading, I'll spend some time in lecture really introducing the biography of the author, giving them context, sort of feeding them, okay, these are the questions I want you to discuss in section. And then really work with the TA using my own knowledge from the discussion project on, okay, how are you going to engage the students? Maybe start off having them collectively review key concepts from lecture, breaking down the reading into certain passages, thinking about other images or sources you could use to engage the students, but really working with the TAs. So I'll give one example of something that I shared, which is adapted from a book by Thomas Mullaney and Christopher Wray called Where Research Begins. They're both at Stanford. Basically, the premise is that we teach, our students to do research, to find sources and analyze them, but how do they actually decide what they want to research, right? Oftentimes, they don't have years of experience in the field. In my course in the Weimar Republic, well, it's, Nazi propaganda. Well, it's Mein Kampf, right? It's sort of Hitler's ideology. Why did Hitler think X, Y, and Z, which is all great, right? But there's so much more there. And that's not necessarily what they're really interested in. Like, maybe what they're really interested in, they're an engineer and they're really interested in like the history of technology, or they play music and they want to know more about like the history of jazz music and popular music in the Weimar Republic. So Where Research Begins, it gives basically a set of exercises that allow students to do searches in various kind of databases for sources and do almost like a physical check of like, which titles of sources actually speak to me, right? Like, what actually really interests me and do I want to discover?
You confront some of the most challenging subjects imaginable: war, atrocity, genocide. How do you introduce and guide your students to interact with the difficult and sometimes disturbing parts of human history?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So even when, I'm kind of touching on topics that are more kind of close to third rails of contemporary politics, I try to, really just take that kind of broader approach, right? That the purpose of any history class, whether it's dealing more with the kind of lived ordinary violence and inequalities of everyday life, or the more kind of extreme examples of violence like that I deal with in my course on genocide and war crimes trials, we're always trying to give students the tools to make more informed judgments and the tools to consider a range of perspectives. I mean, I'll say, in my class on genocide, war crimes trials, human rights in the 20th century, like one of the topics that I dealt with this year for the first time I had taught it was on the kind of origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is it's somewhat beyond, it has a complicated relationship, let's say, to kind of concepts of genocide and the history of genocide. But I'm getting interested in this notion of a so-called right of return in my own scholarship, which is about Germans who were expelled from Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War. So I structured the class around this kind of claim around a right of return as a basis for kind of addressing mass displacement. So students had readings that they completed in advance, sort of addressing this topic. And then in class, I gave them basically a series of readings from like the UN General Assembly, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the Nuremberg laws, various other kind of international resolutions. And I said, rather than saying, well, international law has all of the rules and all of the solutions, which I think is kind of a naive perspective that like students coming into a class on genocide and war crimes trials want to say, oh, there's, international law, there's like a rules-based order and this is constructed and this will like prevent atrocities. And in fact, international law is, ultimately it's a series of interpretations. It's kind of embedded in power relations. And so I say, okay, I want you to read this set of different sources. And then first I want you to tell one story about the right of return from, a Zionist point of view. And then I wanted you to tell another story about the right of return from an anti-Zionist point of view using the same set of sources, right? And the point isn't to say like whether, one idea is right or wrong or to tell students what perspective they should take on an issue that's like become very hot, especially in the last few years in American higher education, but to see that there are different premises and different interpretations that we have to contend with, and that simply thinking that there's some kind of objective international law that is sort of outside of history that has all the answers is not necessarily going to solve things on its own. And I did ask students, at the beginning of that class, like how many people, feel that they know something about this topic or, know a lot or know a little. And for a lot of the students, it was, well, they know a little, because I think there's a kind of caricature about higher education that, all of the students are spending all of their time in these debates about these contentious political issues. And I think for me, a lot of what I would like to see is actually students kind of engaging more, developing their views and their political judgments, and that for students get wrapped up in different ways with their own lives and aren't necessarily following the news in the way that we might think based on kind of sensationalized stories about higher education. So a lot of people didn't have much background knowledge and said at the end of the class that they appreciated that they felt that they had historical context and now a basis to, approach challenging issues they see in the news.
One thing you mentioned earlier was that you recommend having just one reading for a discussion section for students to focus on. And one thing that had me thinking about, I know history, at least when I was in undergrad and graduate school, had a reputation for like, you're going to read a lot, like hundreds of pages every week, and history is like a reading discipline. How do you as an instructor adjust to maybe students have a more limited capacity today for reading mass quantities of homework? How do you adjust to that? And how do you pick what content is most important to be covered in a reading or a lecture? And how do you maybe leave out some content for the sake of better learning within the classroom?
When I mentioned focusing on one reading, that's, I would say, in the sort of 100 and 200 level, especially classes where there's a kind of lecture with a discussion section. The course that I mentioned on genocide, war crimes, trials, and human rights, we call it History 600. It's for sort of advanced majors. So in that case, the students are sort of more experienced with history classes. I think in terms of selecting readings, I mean, first of all, you're always, even if you're assigning 300 pages a week, you're going to be extremely selective because people spend their lives studying topics that are covered in one lecture in an introductory course, right? So we can't have, illusions that we're ever not being selective. And in terms of which readings to pick, I think things that you can tie into contemporary issues, the students' own lives can be interesting. The course in the Weimar Republic, we read this novel called The Artificial Silk Girl by an author, Irmgard Kuhn. It was written in 1932 when she was in her mid-20s, and it's about a 21-year-old girl kind of coming of age trying to make it as an actor in Berlin, right? And so the main character is around the same age as the students, maybe a couple years older, kind of living in, a world saturated by new media forms. She's today be trying to become an influencer or something like that. Even when we study the Industrial Revolution, I have them read this story by the German romantic author E.T.A. Hoffmann called The Sandman, which is all about this kind of inventor who creates the simulacrum of a human who the main character kind of falls in love with, this essentially bot that leads to his downfall. And so there you can certainly make a connection. Both things I mentioned just now are fiction. I mean, so I think thinking, history doesn't just have to be textbooks. It can be fiction. It can be film. It could be, political speeches. So thinking broadly, thinking about bringing in the human voice, how it connects, and then the content kind of will come from there.
So I think that does transition us to thinking about AI. So right now, in the last year or two, AI has really been a big presence for everyone's lives, and especially within higher education. How have you been responding to AI? Have you adapted anything, or are there still challenges that you're thinking about with respect to AI?
It's certainly a challenge. We're having ongoing conversations in the history department, and I think every department in L&S hopefully is having these conversations, and the directors of undergraduate studies over the past several years on history have been really good at facilitating this. I think we're at a point where instructors have an obligation, I think, to know something about how these technologies work, how students are using them. And I'm certainly not going to suggest a kind of universal policy for everybody. So I think one of the tenets, in our department is that each instructor has to think, how could AI either help or hinder the learning objectives in your course, and to kind of design a policy from there. For me, I don't think a total ban is realistic, simply because certain kinds of AI tools are now even incorporated into word processing programs. We know students are using these. So I try to set some boundaries and to suggest to students ways that it might be helpful and ways that it can be harmful. I say one way that they could potentially use it. And again, I think one of our obligations is to think about, well, okay, given that students have access to this, are there ways we can sort of show them to use it in ways that can be productive? It's to use it as kind of a thought partner, a kind of conversation partner, say, well, here's my thesis statement. Can you think of objections and strengthen their thesis statement in that sort of dialogical way? Of course, I always tell my students, well, it's better to do that sort of thing with a peer. And we also do in-class peer reviews, but that's a way that one could use AI. One can use it to strengthen one's writing style in certain ways. I'm very clear that I don't accept papers that are written by AI. That really occludes the student's voice and kind of undermines the purpose of the writing process. And in the Comm B class, it's really sort of focused on research. I mentioned where research begins. I mentioned these sort of earlier assignments for scaffolding. Then I also don't allow students to use AI or I ask them not to, because the whole point is to sort of explore yourself, explore in a sort of low stakes way, in a way that they're not asked to produce polished writing, kind of what topics are of interest to you. I think hopefully starting there will allow students to feel more confident about their research and feel that they don't necessarily need AI. But I do think it's a concern, even if I always tell students, even if you'll be using this in your careers, this is a time in college to really develop those foundational skills that can't be replaced by AI, and that will allow you to be a more savvy user of AI in the future, as opposed to becoming dependent on how these programs work now, and they're going to change and evolve. And so simply learning how to use, an AI program is not actually going to help you in your future. What's going to help you is to become a stronger thinker and writer and speaker, and AI sometimes is a shortcut. So I try to talk with them about it in a serious way, while also acknowledging there may be ways to use it that are more productive than others.
Brandon, thank you for that. And you've mentioned a lot of resources, literature, and teaching and learning resources. Mm-hmm. Are there any things that you're reading, watching, listening to right now that are inspiring you in other ways?
I'll mention a couple of things on the teaching front. I'm enjoying, being on the podcast. I try to listen to podcasts and YouTube. And I think for our kind of generation of academics now, there's so many resources out there that can help you, in your career and become a better teacher. So I mentioned this book, Where Research Begins. The author, Thomas Mullaney, has a YouTube channel called First Gen Professor, which is, it sort of deals with the kind of whole hidden curriculum of academia, everything from how to prepare for your PhD orals defense to how to interact with fellow academics in the mailroom, and really kind of getting to the nitty-gritty. I really enjoyed that, in addition to Where Research Begins. I'll mention a podcast that I found really, both entertaining and informative by a UW-Madison colleague, Ramsey Fawaz, called Nerd from the Future, produced through the English department at UW, which tackles a lot of these interesting issues, kind of contemporary controversies in higher education around the value of the humanities, the value of the university, what is DEI, are we simply doing political indoctrination, right? The answer is no. But trying to kind of tackle some of these concepts with faculty, both from UW and from other campuses, that I've really enjoyed a lot. I'll also mention the Academic Edge podcast, which focuses more on kind of writing for for academics, how to carve out time from teaching and your other responsibilities to make sure that you are maintaining your writing career, which I think is critical at a place like UW-Madison, but also not always at the forefront when we have so many other responsibilities. So those are some other professional sources I would share.
Brandon, it's been great to have you on the show and a real pleasure to learn about your teaching.
Thanks for having me.
This has been the L&S Exchange. For a complete list of all of Brandon's recommendations, visit our website at idc.ls.wisc.edu. There you'll also find the show notes page for this episode and all the conversations from our previous guests. The Exchange is brought to you by L&S Teaching, Learning, and Academic Planning and produced by the L&S Instructional Design Collaborative. We record this podcast on the UW-Madison campus in Van Hise Hall, which sits atop a ridge overlooking Lake Mendota. It's a beautiful spot and has a deeper significance because everything that resides here rests atop ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called day-JOPE since time immemorial.